by this point, I'm sure people know this player base somehow has some sick insecurity issues when it comes to DPSing. It seems like they just seek for this holy grail answer when they just go around in every possible community place, be it Discord, Reddit, MMO Champion, official forums, YouTube, Twitch, and they just ask who top DPS, like they're gonna get a proper answer. What I'm gonna be doing is a series of videos for both melee and ranged DPS, similar to what I did to tanks and healers, but much less reactionary. It's much harder to gauge someone's DPS than it is to gauge tankiness or ability to heal as a spec, because DPS is most of it rated to numbers. A Resto Druid is gonna be a healing over time, very mobile healer. There's not much tuning Blizzard can do to change that compared to, say, an immobile Resto Shaman, right? But when it comes to DPS, a class can be shit at cleave, and then Blizzard gives Marksmanship Hunters Chimera Shot as a talent, and now they have one of the strongest cleave in the game. So this is why I'm not gonna be making any sort of clickbait bullshit, top DPS in Shadowlands, top OP, FOTM, ranged, Mythic Plus spec to choose, and all this sort of garbage that you can see on YouTube. But instead, I'm gonna be looking over the specs and see what changed from BFA coming into Shadowlands. What were their weaknesses in BFA? Have they been fixed? Had this class been barred out of Mythic Plus because they sucked in AoE? Is it gonna be better now? Or is it gonna be still the same? So, for this video it's gonna be about Elemental Shaman, Balanced Druid, Shadow Priest, and Destruction Warlock. And let's start with the first. So, what was Shaman weak in BFA? Shaman in BFA was weak in cleave, and in high, immediate, quick, no ramp-up burst. The problem with Shaman is that they could hit one target or they could hit 5. In the middle there was this gaping hole where they didn't really have the tools to correctly hit 2 or 3 targets properly. This is similar to Retribution Paladin. In terms of slow ramp up, it's similar to Assassination Rogue. They had this glaring issue in BFA. Now, Shaman went through Fulmination, attempted rework, which failed miserably. At least Blizzard had the hindsight to just say, okay, sorry, we messed up, we're going back. And they went back to Maelstrom, but they actually brought some extra stuff. It's not the same as BFA, because the Maelstrom version now has been massively improved. Shaman has a much higher damage ratio on its spells. I know, I already said this on the Resto Shaman. It's not very exciting to hear that your class has been buffed simply because your numbers are bigger, and not because you have something new. But Shaman's got bigger numbers now, so they hit harder. Their Elemental Blast has been improved. It generates 30 Maelstrom. It's gone back to being a generator again. It's a much stronger option now. Ice Fury also has been buffed. Obviously Lightning Bolt, Chain Lightning and Lava Burst have all been buffed. Shaman now has 2 key very strong legendaries that you can use. These 2. One is extremely good in both single target and cleave, which is the problem that Shaman had in BFA. And one is also good in cleave but also spread cleave, because it's going to shoot Lava Burst at all affected targets by Flame Shock, so they can be spread. Echoes of the Great Sundering, that's gonna empower your Earthquake, is extremely good in cleave, because, you know, now on 2 and 3 targets you do have an answer. You have a massively empowered Earthquake that you can drop down on all 3 of them, all 2 of them, however many they are. This is a much stronger version of a cleave compared to what Shaman had in BFA. Again, numbers are numbers. We don't know how they're gonna be on release or on Mythic Week, whatever, whenever Blizzard goes for tuning. But for now, assuming numbers stay relatively the same, Shaman has now very good cleave. It's not the best in general, but it's still now much better than they had before in BFA, so this has been improved. They haven't lost much in single target or in AoE, so their movement has been slightly improved as well, because they have Spirit Walker Grace baseline now compared to before. So all in all, Elemental Shaman has just been improved, and most importantly, most crucially, they have been improved in their weakest damage profile. They have been improved in their absolute weakest spot, which was also the strongest spot, the strongest type of damage that was required in raids. Raids for almost 2 expansions now have been dominated by quick. An ad is spawning, you need to kill it in 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. Some sort of cleave was what was required. Burst cleave, you know, very high ramp up damage to take down that target. And this is what Shaman was always super weak in. So now Shaman has been improved in most of the areas, but particularly the lack of cleave has now been fixed, which is why I think it's very good. It's a very good spec coming into Shadowlands. Obviously waiting for the tuning that's going to happen. I think it has to be tuned down in some numbers, but it looks definitely promising. So, what were the problems of Destruction Warlock in BFA? Well, the problem of Destruction Warlock in BFA was essentially no AoE. Destruction Warlock had a Rain of Fire that hit for nothing, and that was it. They were gated entirely by waiting for the Infernal every 3 minutes, and that's it. That was all they had. In Shadowlands, Destruction Warlock has received very few changes when it comes to talents, when it comes to the way they play. Most of the stuff is in fact the same. They just received some tiny changes to improve their AoE. Inferno, the useless Rain of Fire talent, now also buffs Rain of Fire damage by 20%. You also have Roaring Blaze now, which has been changed. Roaring Blaze used to put a useless DOT on your Conflagrate. Now Conflagrate increases the damage of your Immolate, Incinerate, and Conflagrate by 30%. This is a buff to single target, this is a buff to cleave. And if you take Fire and Brimstone, which makes your Incinerate splash damage, Roaring Blaze buffing Incinerate is also a buff to AoE. The legendaries are also very good when it comes to variety. They have the Madness of the Ajakir, which is pure single target, as well as cleave buff for destruction. They have Odor, which is even more buffs to cleave, as well as Wilfred's Sigil, which is a massive buff to everything, which is why I think it's going to be the baseline for most Warlocks, because of the Infernal cooldown reduction. So overall, Destruction Warlock's weakest damage profile was AoE, and it has been improved. Not only that, but what they were strong in has been improved even more in their cleave. They are still mediocre on single target, but that was to be expected. They are just, it's not that they are terrible, they're just okay. I just hope that people don't expect to come into Shadowlands with the abomination that was the end of BFA Destruction. That was similar to Prot Warrior. That was an amalgamation of band-aids that were given to Destruction because Destruction was unplayable at the start of the expansion. So Flashpoint, Azerite trait, Rolling Havoc, Azerite trait, Vision of Perfection, compounding all on each other created this disaster by the end of the expansion. So you weren't going to get that in Shadowlands, right? That wasn't going to happen. Overall, I've been enjoying Destruction Warlock. I think it's a very smooth spec with a very clear strength, which is cleave, and the other two scenarios, which are okay. The problem in BFA is that the other scenario, specifically AoE, was absolutely garbage, which made them terrible in Mythic Plus. But now that's also strengthened. Similar to Elemental Shaman and their weakness, Destruction also has been improved overall. When it comes to their movement, they have Demonic Circle baseline, so it's also a plus. So overall, I think Destruction Warlock is in a pretty good spot right now, and it's pretty enjoyable to play. Now let's move on to Balanced Druid. So looking at the talents, you would think nothing changed. Basically nothing new to Balanced Druid besides Heart of the Wild becoming a baseline ability. Like Druid needed any more utility, right? Typhoon is now baseline, and they get Heart of the Wild as a talent. Everything else remained the same. They have changed in a much more smooth rotation and a much more engaging rotation compared to BFA. This is something I already mentioned for Elemental and Destro. You know, it's kind of a recurrent thing. Their Eclipse has been changed for the 600th time. Now Eclipse is simply going to buff your Wrath for 15 seconds after you cast 2 Starfires, and then buff your Starfire when you cast 2 Wrath. They are alternating, so you have to bounce from one to the next and then start over. The cool thing is that now your Mastery is going to increase your damage, your solar damage and your nature damage during your Eclipse, and your finishers, your Starfall and your Star Surge, do astral damage, which counts as both. So during your Eclipses, your spenders now do double damage. Another very cool thing is that now your Starfall is going to extend the duration of your dots when you cast it, and your Star Surge is going to empower the current Eclipse it's in. The more Star Surges you cast during Lunar Eclipse, the more AoE damage your Starfire will do. The more Star Surges you cast during Solar Eclipse, the more damage your Wrath will do. Stacking. So as many as you can cast, the more damage it's gonna do. So this has been made the spec much more smooth to play and much more sort of engaging. However, we still have a problem, Druid bros. What's the problem? The problem is that Druid had some weaknesses in BFA, which were its cleave and its AoE. And something I mentioned before, its lack of burst. And none of this has been changed in Shadowlands. As I mentioned, the talents are still the same and nothing changed. As I mentioned, Eclipse changing and some extra damage during your Eclipse phases is going to be good for single target with Star Surge, but not for cleave, because you still have nothing to cleave. And your AoE has potentially even been made weaker because Starfall doesn't stack. Starfall is now gigantic, it's super huge, much more easy to use. It can extend your dots, but you can't stack it, you can't increase your AoE damage in any way with Starfall once it's down. Your legendaries do nothing other than empowering your Starfire and your Star Surge and your synergy with it. Onyx Clear Vision as a chance to make your spender free. Primordial Arcanic Pulsar can give you Celestial Alignment. Time Run Dreambinder can discount your spenders, but nothing that makes you hit multiple targets, nothing that makes you cleave, nothing that increases your AoE in any way. So I think that overall, if you were looking for Balanced Druid to be different than BFA, then this is not the spec for you. They are still a very strong single target spec with acceptable AoE and terrible cleave. It has not changed coming into Shadowlands, and looking at the legendaries and the conduits and the covenants even, it doesn't look like it's gonna change. There is nothing that's gonna make them very strong in that department. If you enjoyed the way it played in BFA, then you're gonna enjoy it even more in Shadowlands. If you just enjoyed the way they played regardless of their weaknesses, then they're still strong in what they were strong in, except now it feels better to play. So it's gonna be just right up your alley if you enjoyed it before. And lastly, on our first pass on the range spec, in this group of 4 we have Shadow Priest. I'm not going to go over all the changes that happened in Shadow Priest. There have been many of them over time. Just what you need to know is the whole Void Form thing has been scrapped. Void Form now is simply Void Eruption, 90-second cooldown, and that's it. It's just a strong DPS cooldown now. It no longer revolves your entire talent system, your legendary system, your conduit system will not revolve around your Void Form or your Insanity gain or anything of that sort. Insanity now is just your builder-spender style resource, just like Maelstrom, just like Rage. The spec has received several changes now. It is more straightforward. It remembers you more of the Shadow Priest from Mist of Pandaria, even Cataclysm. Also Warlocks of Draenor, without the whole Shadow Weaving, Mind Spike style. You put Vampiric Touch and Shadow War Pain on the target, you Mind Blast on cooldown, you Mind Flay as a filler. When you proc Dark Thoughts, you get an instacast Mind Blast that you can cast while channeling Mind Flay or Mind Seer, and then you dump your Insanity on Devouring Plague. That's all. Is way more straightforward. Your talents have had plenty of quality of life changes. Thankfully, you have Shadow War Death baseline. Overall, the specs feels just more smooth, if more simple in the process. There is no more 400 IQ required to work around your Insanity generation, your Void Form, maintaining Void Form, when to go into Void Form, how many stacks of Lingering Insanity, and all of that is gone now. It is way more straightforward. So in that sense, if you enjoyed the previous version, if you enjoyed Void Form, if you enjoyed Insanity, then this is not the spec for you anymore. On the other hand, if you enjoyed a much more straightforward version of Shadow Priest, a more old school version, then this is perfect for you. I really enjoyed this as an old school style of Shadow Priest. Now, on to the problems. We have done this for all the other specs. We have to do it for Shadow Priest as well. Shadow Priest problems in BFA were complete lack of mobility and terrible cooldowns for itself when it came to burst damage. As well, yeah, they had quite a few problems, as well as lack of AoE. What has changed? Shadow Priest now has slightly better AoE. They still have extremely strong, very, very strong cleave, spread cleave, dot cleave, whatever you want to call it. They're still super strong. Their single target is still good. As a matter of fact, it's better than before. The Devouring Plague is a very strong single target nuke. I know it's weird to call it nuke because it's a DOT, but seriously, it's a fucking nuke. It really hurts. And then because they have Power Infusion baseline and Void Eruption baseline, their cooldowns are slightly better, but they are still mainly over time. You know, they're longer. Power Infusion just buffs up your stat. It doesn't really do much else. Void Eruption doesn't do that much damage, it just gives you an extra button to do single target damage with your Void Bolt. So it is still rather weak when it comes to burst, it's rather weak when it comes to AoE, it still requires ramp up. As I mentioned, the Devouring Plague hits like a truck, but you need Insanity to hit like a truck, so it takes a while. You don't just hit 2 buttons and you can immediately Death Sweep and I-Beam like a Demon Hunter, you have to wait a while. So at the same time, yes, if you didn't like Shadow Priest before because of all the Insanity thing, now this is going to be perfect for you. But if you also disliked Shadow Priest because of the way its damage profile was, then you're also going to dislike this version, because this version doesn't really fix most of the problems it had in terms of the way it did damage. And lastly, movement problems are still there. Really nothing changed when it came to movement. They are still piss poor at moving around. And with this we are done with the first 4 range specs. I wanted to spread around the classes I would pass over. I started with Elemental, where I think the changes were the best overall, and then Destruction Warlock, where I think the changes were very good in multiple areas of its kit, and then Balance, where most of the changes were to improve the things it was already good at, but sort of keep the weaknesses. And then you had Shadow Priest, where it went to an entire overall while still sort of keeping the same weaknesses and strengths. Tune in tomorrow for the melee DPS videos, and 5 points to whoever guesses who are going to be the first 4 melee specs I'm gonna be putting out.